had tried to protect slavery, and that was, unfortunately, the Democrats, made a deal with the progressive Republican. And in the 19th century and early 20th century, the Republican Party was the progressive party. So Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt were progressives, just like, let's say, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And of course, that relationship changed Ronald Reagan, where the Republicans became the reactionary party and the Democrats became the progressive party. But after the Civil War, we did have 10 years of Reconstruction. And during that period, 3 Reconstruction amendments were passed by Congress and ratified by the states. This was a remarkable achievement. The 13th Amendment prohibited slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States and guaranteed each person due process and equal protection of the law. And the 15th Amendment, and this is the key one for our purpose, the 15th Amendment provided that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or a previous condition of servitude. So the 15th Amendment is the one here. The amendments also gave Congress the power to enforce their provisions, appropriate legislation. Now, Congress didn't do that. And after the only 10-year period of Reconstruction, we entered the period of Jim Crow, and the voting rights of African Americans and other minorities were greatly affected. Texas was one of the most entrenched slave states there was during the Civil War. They explicitly based their right to secede from the Union because they said slaves cannot manage their own affairs, and it was quite racist. So racism runs deep, and the Mexican Americans were also suppressed. That was the reason for the creation of the Texas Rangers. All during the 19th century and early 20th century, the Rangers their sole duty was to suppress the Mexican American, and they killed wantonly and murdered people. But they eventually, and this happened during the 10s and the 20s of the last century, they became a professional law enforcement organization, and that's what they are now. But Texas has a long history of discrimination against minorities. So because of that, African Americans, Latinos, were prohibited from voting and had their rights infringed to vote, all during the latter half of the 19th century and during most of the 20th century. Now, Lyndon Johnson was aware of it. He saw in Texas how minorities were affected. And of course, at this time in the history of the Democratic Party, the Democrats were the progressive party, and Johnson was heavily influenced by Martin Luther King, his philosophy on violence. Johnson was able to get Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this is one of the most important pieces of legislation our country ever had. It addressed the entrenched racial discrimination in voting, which, quote, was a insidious and pervasive evil which had been perpetrated in certain parts of our country through unremitting and ingenious defiance of the Constitution. So all during the time after the Civil War, due to the Reconstruction amendments, especially the 15th Amendment, every minority had the right to vote, but it was not being allowed due to Jim Crow laws and other means by which states would defy the Constitution. This law was an amazing piece of legislation. It had 2 important sections. It had 5 sections, but let's talk about the 2 important ones. Section 4B contained a coverage formula that determined which jurisdictions are subject to preclearance based on their histories of discrimination in voting. Now, states were recognized in the law, and Texas was one of them. In fact, most of the southern states were recognized: Alabama, Mississippi, North and South Carolina, Arkansas. These were all states from the Confederacy, but also some areas in northern states were subject to this. So they all had to obtain preclearance, and preclearance is defined in Section 5. This requires states and local governments, certain states, not all the states, just the ones that had a history of discrimination, to obtain federal preclearance by either the Justice Department or a 3-judge panel before they implemented any change to their voting laws or practice. And this would include voter qualifications, voting locations, voting times, voting districts, and district boundaries, election district boundaries. This law prevented, for a period from 1965 until relatively recently, only 5 years ago, from doing things that would prevent minorities from voting. However, this law was damaged heavily in 2013, only 5 years ago, by a 5-4 vote of the Supreme Court in a suit called Shelby County versus Holder. It said that Section 4B is unconstitutional because the coverage formula is based on data over 40 years old, making it no longer responsive to current needs, and thus creating an impermissible burden on the constitutional principle of federalism and equal sovereignty of the states. Now, this 5-4 decision was a right-wing versus the progressive Democrats decision. So this is one of those several 5-4 decision destroyed the progressive legacy which we have from the 19th and early 20th centuries. The court did not strike down Section 5, which requires preclearance. But since the coverage formula was removed, they couldn't use Section 5 to do anything. Instead, to enforce Section 5, you had to go to court. You actually had to go to federal court and try to get remedy of preclearance through that means, which is a very hard and exhaustive. So this was essentially a vote to allow discrimination and voter suppression in the United States by the Supreme Court, a 5-4 decision. This is one of the worst Supreme Court decisions we've had. It's like Citizens United. It's like the 2 Supreme Court decisions which have allowed vouchers now, which is public tax money going to private schools. And there's several other really bad decisions by the Supreme Court. These are all 5-4 decisions. And the right wing in this country, the Republicans, use the court. They're so desperate to use the court and keep that 5-4 majority that they will do anything, even refuse to approve a presidential nominee to be voted on by the Senate. Now, right after the decision, several states immediately enacted laws for voter suppression because they were no longer subjected to preclearance. These included North Carolina, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Texas. The gerrymandering began when the Republicans took control of the state legislature, both houses, and the governorship. That happened in 2003. As soon as they got complete control of the both legislative bodies and the governorship, they began gerrymandering. In fact, I'll talk about that in a minute, too. And Texas enacted their rule immediately after. In fact, as soon as the next day, they promised they would do this after the Supreme Court decision. They were being held up their maps were being held up for preclearance by the Justice Department because they were so egregiously discriminatory. But right after that, they got them passed. They got them through because there was no mechanism of preclearance. And this was a setup. This was a plan by the Republican Party and by their various groups like ALEC, where they plan to do things like this in order to get power and to maintain power. North Carolina terminated valid out-of-precinct voting, same-day registration during early voting, pre-registration for teenagers about to turn 18. And Ohio approved a bill that eliminated a week of early voting, the one that minorities used to vote. They also made it easier for registrars to reject absentee ballots. Wisconsin enacted a voter ID law. Now, here's what Texas did. And I want to emphasize that gerrymandering is just one item or one aspect of voter suppression. Voter suppression is the crime here. This is what the Shelby County versus Holder law, overturning preclearance, overturning the Voting Rights Act of 1965, allows. It allows voter suppression. Of course, Texas gerrymandering. Even the Democratic Party before 2002 had designed boundaries to favor their own candidates, but they did not engage in really vicious, deep gerrymandering. But when the Republicans took control, they did. Here's an example. After the 2010 census, where Texas gained 4 more U.S. representatives due to the tremendous population growth. Of those 4, the population growth, 3/4 of, in fact, it was about 80%, was due to the growth in Latinos, in Hispanic American minorities. And they should have gotten, if it was proportional, 3 of those 4 congressional seats. Instead, they only got 1 because the districts were gerrymandered to favor Republican candidates. And that's how vicious it was. All state boundaries, the Senate districts, state House districts, the State Board of Education districts are gerrymandered. Austin, for instance, is split in half. I was told by one person, there's no gerrymandering with the State Board of Education. Oh, yes, there is. Austin is a very large area, very populous area. It always had 1 state board representative. Instead, they gerrymandered it by splitting Austin, Texas in half and creating 2 extremely long boundaries that went north and south through Republican districts so that Austin is represented by 2 right-wing Republicans, and they happen to be creationists, young earth creationists. And my main activity since 1980 has been fighting the censorship and the suppression of science, especially evolution, climate change, health education, sex education, by the Texas State Board of Education. So I was well aware of this. The Republicans, of the 10 Republicans, they were all white, all Anglo. They almost all of them are young earth creationists. So they were opposed to science in general. The 5 Democrats, 2 were African American, 3 were Latinos. They were all minorities. There was no white Democrat. So the contrast was appalling, and that was done by gerrymandering, because if they had not gerrymandered Austin would have had a probably a white Anglo state board member. So I'm well aware of personally of this because I went to Austin so many times, lobbied the State Board of Education. So gerrymandering was enacted viciously. We also have the voter ID law. As I will explain later, our voter ID laws are being litigated, and we have achieved victories in federal court. Unfortunately, for gerrymandering, we haven't. They tried to eliminate early voting period, but that stopped. But many states were able to do that. Texas has never had registering and voting on the same day, but states that had it, it was eliminated. They did create rules to make it easier to reject absentee ballots. They created rules to make it impossible for freed felons to vote. We now have new census questions about citizenship. The question about citizenship is meant to suppress voters. It's meant to get minorities who are not citizens refuse to take the census and thus dilute their numbers in the population so that proportionally the whites will then get greater numbers and be counted more. And I just found out just yesterday, Texas has been ignoring the so-called federal motor voter law, which allows voter registration at the Department of Public Safety. That's our state traffic division, which when you obtain a driver's license, you're supposed to be offered voter registration in the state. This has been ignored, and that's being litigated. So all these things, gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and now federal motor voter law are being litigated in Texas. This is a tremendous outcome, and I want to emphasize that this is a deliberate, intentional system that the Republicans engaged in to get the power to do voter suppression. There is a book. In fact, there are many articles, but there is a book by David Daley. It's called RATF, RATF blank blank KED, and that word is the word that is used when you are viciously your votes are viciously suppressed by the authorities. The way this works, and that's what the book does, RATF, and it's really the word you all know, documents the effort of Republican legislators. You're being screwed by politicians who have gained so much political control that they can redistrict as much as they want. So after the 2010 census, Republicans developed secretly a program, an audacious redistricting plan called Red Map. They gave the money they raised through Citizens United. This is corporate money. Instead of giving it to federal candidates, they gave it to local elections so that they could get majorities in both houses of the legislature and the governorship, as many states as they could. And they control, and if they have that, they can control the redistricting of that state. 15th Amendment gives states the right to devise their own election boundary. That's extremely important. There is no national system or fair system or neutral to redistrict boundaries for political purposes. So states have that themselves. And usually if you have both houses of your legislature and your governor, you can do that yourself. And the Republicans control 33 states in that manner. Now, some states, like say California and New York, use neutral, unbiased systems of redistricting. They have nonpartisan redistricting panels that fairly redistrict. And studies have shown, in California, by the way, New York are overwhelmingly Democrat. Studies have shown that if you did this in every state, the Democrats would have national majorities in every election, and most Senate elections, too. The Democrats would control the Senate and the House and the president. They would control it all if we had fair elections where gerrymandering was not taking place. So there have been professional studies done by scholars showing that this is the case. So the only way Republicans can win is by voter suppression. And gerrymandering is probably the major type of voter suppression. But I want to emphasize it's not the only one they use. They use the voter ID laws, and they manipulate voting periods and voting times and voting locations. We vote on a Tuesday. Many people need to vote early because they work every Tuesday. They can't vote, and they work long hours, and the lines are long, and that's all designed by purpose. So they shorten early voting, and they restrict the number of voting locations. So these are all ploys that the Republicans use for voter suppression, and gerrymandering is only one of these. So really, we have to look at all the methods that are used by the Republicans to unfairly, discriminatory ways, using discrimination to suppress minority votes. That is my key theme here of what I'm interested in.
What is the one thing that you would like people to know about gerrymandering in Texas right now?
In Texas, we because we are a very gerrymandered state, we litigated our boundaries too, just like North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And as you know, you've probably had your guests, other speakers, discuss the fact that they are winning in federal court. Texas laws. Our local federal court, we had a federal 3-judge panel